Hello, everyone, and welcome to this course on ecological economics, which is about rethinking the economy within ecological limits. You must have seen my introductory video. If in case you have missed it, let me briefly introduce myself, as today is the first class of this module. So I am Anamika Barua, a professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Guwahati, and I am also an ecological economist. What we plan to do in this course in ecological economics is we will, briefly try to first set or explore the foundation of ecological economics before we move into more about what exactly is ecological economics, and how it deals with real world challenges. So traditional economics thinking, usually treats economy as something separate from nature. This is where ecological economics comes in, because ecological economics asks a very fundamental question, and that question is that can economic growth continue indefinitely on a finite planet? This is the core, understanding or core part of ecological economics, or core question that ecological economics asks. So in today's lecture, what we will do is we will trace the evolution of economic thought, starting from classical economics, because it's very important to understand this historical background before we bring out why a new perspective such as ecological economics became necessary. Okay, so how the word environment was understood in economics is something that we need to first deal with. So to begin with, let us understand how economists historically viewed environment, right? So for a long time, the dominant belief was that environment is a subset of the economy, as you see in the slide as well, that in other words, the economy was seen as the primary system, and nature simply supported it, rather than being the larger system within which the economy operates. So economy was larger than the environment, larger than the ecosystem. And within this framework, nature was assigned two main roles. First, it was seen as a provider of raw materials, such as land, water, minerals, energy. Second, it was treated as a sink for waste, meaning it could absorb all the production generated through production and consumption. So this way of thinking led to a strong assumption that there are no real limits to economic growth. As you see in the figure as well, I have given arrows going out, meaning it can grow forever. It was believed that even if resources became scarce or environmental problems emerged, technology would provide solutions, either by finding substitutes of that natural resource or improving efficiency. Now, this confidence further reinforced during the Industrial Revolution, which I think most of you are aware of, which began in the mid 18th century, around 1760s, and continued into the early 19th century. During this period, rapid technological advancements and the expansion of machine-based production led to unprecedented economic growth. As a result, economists became increasingly confident that growth could continue indefinitely. However, what this perspective largely ignored is that ecological systems are finite and have limits. Natural resources are not infinite, and ecosystems have also limited capacity to absorb waste. So ignoring these limits can actually lead to long-term environmental degradation and sustainability challenges, which is something that we are today dealing with. So this early way of thinking actually laid the foundation for a major gap in economic analysis, the neglect of the ecological limits or ecological constraints. Before we go into this discussion more in detail, let me now turn to classical economics. Now, those who belong to economics background would know what classical economics is, but for those who are new to economics, so this is a school of thought which developed roughly between the 17th and late 18th century, during a time when economies were beginning to transform and expand. This was also the time when industrial revolution set in. So classical economists were primarily concerned with understanding how markets function and how wealth is created within an economy. They were trying to answer fundamental questions such as what drives production, how prices are determined, how economies grow over time. But one of the key feature of their thinking was a strong belief in free markets. So they argued that when individuals pursue their own interests, like you and I, when we pursue our own interests, markets tend to allocate resources efficiently. So what if we as a rational consumer, or if I'm a firm, if I would be a rational producer, if I'm pursuing my own interest, I would always ensure that resources are utilized in the right way. And that is why that finally makes market more efficient. Therefore, they always advocated for minimal government intervention, believing that too much interference, such as taxation, subsidies, etc., could disrupt the natural functioning of the market. So market could determine everything. Market will set the prices right as well. So there is no need for any government intervention. And their analysis was largely centered on production, economic growth, and efficiency, with particular emphasis on factors like labor, land, and capital. However, this brings us also to a very important question, which is what is this module is about. That did classical economists consider limits to growth at all? And interestingly, the answer actually is yes, but only to a certain extent. While they did recognize some constraints, especially related to population growth and land scarcity, their understanding of limits was still quite narrow and not really framed in ecological terms as we think today. So we will explore these early concerns in more detail in the subsequent slides. Okay, so the core ideas of classical economics. So let us now look more closely at how classical economists understood the economy, particularly in relation to the environment. So as I mentioned, at the core of classical economics is a strong belief in free market. The idea is that markets function best when they are left to operate on their own, guided by the forces of supply and demand with minimum government intervention. Now, this is closely linked to one of the key thinkers of classical economists is Adam Smith. Again, he's also known as father of economics, who is his famous concept of invisible hand, where individuals, by pursuing their own interests, unintentionally contributes to overall economic welfare. Then another important feature, like I mentioned, was focus on production and growth, particularly focusing on use of labor and land. Now, at the same time, classical economists believe that economy is self-regulating. That is, market would naturally move towards a state of equilibrium or balance. So any issue such as unemployment or shortage of any resource may temporarily disturb the market, but eventually it will get corrected on its own. Now, this is very important to remember, because here what basically is being put forth is market is the main ingredient of economics, right? So everything can be regulated on its own. Even if there are certain disruption, that can also be taken care of through market mechanism. Now, if we look at the key thinkers in this tradition, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, John Stuart Mill, we see that while they strongly believed in markets and growth, they were not entirely also unaware of limits. And that is something that we are going to discuss in more detail, is that they were concerned particularly related to population growth and the availability of land itself. So while classical economics laid the foundation for understanding markets and growth, its treatment of the environment remained also quite limited, largely viewing nature as a factor of production rather than a system within its own boundaries. So while they acknowledged limit, but they did not acknowledge land as an environmental factor. They mostly, or as something, it's nature, provided by nature. They looked at them more as an input for production processes. Okay, let us now examine a very important question, like I was talking about, that, how do they also understood the limits to growth. So this is something where the answer is, like I mentioned, that they all spoke about limits to growth, but mostly from the scarcity that arising from the population growth mainly. Now, if you look at Malthus's theory, Thomas Malthus, who made one of the earliest and most influential argument in this regard. So in 1798, Malthus argued that population tends to grow faster than the resources required to sustain it, particularly food. So this is important to remember, that he made a prediction that population will grow much, much faster than the amount of food that has to be produced to sustain that population. This would create a situation where resource scarcity would become inevitable, making it impossible for the economy to grow forever. So importantly, when Malthus spoke about resource scarcity, he was primarily referring to land, because he explained that since land is fixed, right, you cannot increase the amount of land that we have. So since land is fixed, increasing population will actually lead to diminishing return from land, which means that a lot of people will start engaging in food production, because there's a lot of people who can now get into the labor market. But the return, the amount of effort that one is putting and the return that is going to come is going to start falling down, particularly because, especially in agriculture, because now you have too much of people to engage in same piece of land. And on top of it, if people do not have enough food to eat, then obviously people are going to starve. And when all of these things would actually happen, then naturally the labor force would slowly start coming down, investment will start coming down, and overall the economy will stop also moving up. So, however, Malthus somehow failed to anticipate two crucial developments. First, he underestimated the role of technological progress, which was already beginning to transform agricultural productivity. Now, if you really look at Malthus' prediction, it's also a fact that population has grown many-fold across the world, but land continues to be fixed. But we are yet able to sustain or produce enough food for everybody to eat. So, then that is mainly because although we cannot increase the land, but the productivity from the land can be definitely increased. So that was something that Malthus did not anticipate. Second, he did not foresee that economic development itself could not lead to a decline in population growth, as we now observe in many countries, that he did not foresee that, as many of the Scandinavian countries, etc., that you see, because they have very good economic development, it could actually finally lead to decline in population growth. So we do see this in many developed countries, which is also something which he missed, that development itself can make people aware that they need to have lesser population, will go for family planning, for example. So because of these limitations, his theory was later criticized and also came to be labeled as a part of dismal science, suggesting an overly pessimistic view of the future. So nobody took that theory something that one needs to act on. And so Malthus may have been incorrect in some of his prediction at that time, but his work remains significant because it introduced a fundamental idea into economics. And that idea was the scarcity can constrain growth. So this was a very, very important point that Malthus actually brought up, that if there is scarcity of land, if we are not able to produce enough that people need to sustain themselves, then eventually it's going to stop our economy from growing as well due to starvation. This concern with scarcity and distribution forms an important foundation even when we do our later discussion related to ecological economics, although in a little different way. All right, so this was about Malthus. Now, if you move to Ricardo, Ricardo was also a very well-known classical economist and was also, interestingly, a very good friend of Malthus. So Ricardo actually accepted or agreed the theory of population that Malthus gave. And he came up with a concept which he called it as a steady state economy, which also was a very important contribution of classical economics, which is related to the idea of limits. So Ricardo's writing in early 19th century actually argued that economies cannot grow indefinitely. And unlike the strong optimism about growth that we will see later when neoclassical economics came in, Ricardo actually clearly recognized that there are natural constraints to economic expansion. So his core idea was that over time, economic growth slows down and eventually it will reach what he calls as a steady state. And so what is that steady state? He mentioned that this is a state where output would stop growing, profits would begin to fall, and wages remain at a subsistence level, meaning so less wage that it's a situation of hand to mouth. People would not have enough money to further invest. So Ricardo explained this again from the role of land, which he considered, again, like Malthus, fixed and a limited resource. Whereas in the case of Malthus, he explained this more from the lens of population growth. In the case of Ricardo, he explained this more from the lens of land. So what he basically tried to explain is that as population increases, taking from what Malthus mentioned and bringing more light to it, more and more land will now have to be brought under cultivation. Now, how do we usually, decide where to make an investment? First of all, you will always go to those land which are heavily fertile land, so that you make a little bit of investment and you get a lot of output in return. But when your population starts growing and you have limited fertile land, what would you do? You will now also have to move to land which is not so much fertile. So over time, cultivation extends to less productive, or which we call it as marginal land, those lands which are not really otherwise would have been our choice to invest and go for agricultural production. One clear point to make here is that why are we talking about agriculture? Because we are talking about 17th and 18th century. In fact, even before the Industrial Revolution had set in a full-fledged. So this was more about an agricultural economy across the world. So therefore, what the problem here was that land being limited, cultivation extending toward less productive or marginal land is obviously going to increase the cost of production, especially for food. And why the cost of production will increase? Because in a fertile land, you will need less labor, you will need less investment, you will need less effort to produce food grain. But if you are now putting your effort in a less fertile or less productive land, you will have to put much more input, including, for example, labor. Now, that is going to increase the cost of production, right? And not just labor, even the capital has to be invested in much more amount. Now, at the same time, what happens is that landowners benefit because rent is going to rise, right? Because those uh, landowners who have only fertile land, now they will be in high demand. And so they can say that, okay, we will provide you the land if you give us more rent. So there is going to be an increase in the rent. However, for producers or capitalists, therefore profit will start coming down. Because if I am a landowner and if you are someone who is investing, you will have to now give much more money to me as rent. At the same time, you will have to invest also a lot to make that land productive. So whatever you used to earn as profit is now going to come down. And this is crucial because when profit falls, incentive to invest will also start declining, right? Because they will not have enough money to reinvest. Another interesting thing about classical economics is that they completely distinguish between one who is a landowner, one who is going to invest, and one who is labor, who will provide their labor in doing all these activities. So eventually, the economy reaches a stage where there is no motivation actually for further investment, because even if they invest, they know that they're not going to get enough profit. In fact, they may make a loss. And so the economic growth, stagnates. It just stops. So Ricardo's key insight here is very important, that economic growth is ultimately actually constrained, if you look at it today, by a natural resource, which is land. Although his analysis was focused on land and agriculture, the broader idea that if you look at it today, is that natural limits can actually restrict economic expansion, and which is highly relevant, especially when we think about, the kind of situation that we see that natural resources can actually limit economic growth. But the points to remember here is that both Malthus and Ricardo did come up with their theory and mentioned that there would be a situation where the economy would stop growing. So for Ricardo, the steady state was not a desirable situation. No economy should try to or should even, achieve something like a steady state, or they would not like to move towards a steady state economy, because that is not something good, because that is going to stop the economy from growing. Now, it is important for us to also understand fall of classical economics. Now, despite these insights, classical economies eventually declined. They declined, like I mentioned, for Malthus' case, even for Ricardo, many things which was actually happening in the ground were not taken into consideration when these theories started to came out. So one major reason was it could not actually even adequately explain real world economic crisis. Say, for example, it mentioned that when there will be a lot of unemployment, market will automatically take care of it. And it did not happen during Great Depression. So it could not provide answers that why, first of all, Great Depression happened, and why it took so much time to get out of the Great Depression. So its assumptions were considered to be too simplistic, particularly the idea that market always self-correct. This also led to new approaches coming in, and this is where the Keynesian economics came in, the neoclassical economics basically that came in, and this also marked a transition from a focus on production and limit to from production and limit to a focus on optimization, efficiency, and individual decision making, which is something what neoclassical economics brought in. So to conclude, we have seen that classical economists did recognize limits to growth, particularly in relation to population and land. For Malthus, population; for Ricardo, land. However, these concerns were unfortunately, gradually overshadowed by the new economic thinking that placed greater emphasis, as I mentioned, on efficiency, on markets. And so in the next lecture, we will explore the rise of neoclassical economics and also examine how the idea of ecological limits was further sidelined when neoclassical economics came in. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in the next class.